When Disney bought the Star Wars IP back in 2012, the big question on everyone's mind was, what direction will the franchise go? Will we see an attempt to continue the Skywalker saga, or will we follow a bounty hunter type character into the galaxy's seedy underworld? Or will we focus more on the origins of the Jedi, or perhaps more about the rebellion? The answer is that Disney did all of the above, probably for two reasons. One, to make an obscene amount of cash, and two, to find out what direction the wind was blowing in with the fans. What type of Star Wars story would be the most successful and would point the franchise in the right direction for future development? Now, one of those possibilities you'll find in the television series Andor, whose second and final season is now finished. So in this video, the question I'm asking is simple. Does Andor point the Star Wars franchise in a good direction? There are major spoilers in this video, so if you're not done watching, then this is your warning. If you're interested in Star Wars even a little bit, you'll probably know that its fandom is somewhat fractured at the moment. There's no clear consensus on what's working and what's not, at least in the current Disney era of Star Wars storytelling. Now, Andor is no exception. There's lots of debate about this show, and so with that in mind, I want to present opposing arguments in this video. I'll make the case that Andor is Disney's highest achievement so far, and then I'll play devil's avocado and discuss the opposing view, sort of like if Socrates were discussing Star Wars. So first, why Andor works. And to me, the biggest strength is that it's a serious exploration of the moral complexity of power, corruption, and dissent. In that way, it's very different from the black and white moral universe of the original films. It consciously deviates from traditional Star Wars in that sense. So there's no purely virtuous hero and no purely malevolent evil. It's all shades of gray, and each of its many characters is meant to explore some aspect of the moral ambiguity inherent in the struggle for power. So there's the reluctant rebel, a familiar Star Wars trope. There's the shadowy puppet master whose commitment to the cause and secrecy above all else compels him to manipulate and deceive. There's the young bureaucrat whose overbearing mother has instilled in him a desire for order. There's the ambitious imperial officer driven by personal glory in a system of oppression whose true depth of evil only becomes apparent the more complicit she becomes in its crimes. And there's the wealthy senator who is close enough to power that her true intent must be concealed at all costs, even if it means sacrificing the things she loves most dearly. Now, each of these characters poses his or her own unique moral question, and none of them resolves with a simplistic answer. As the show reaches its conclusion, the interactions between and among these characters paints a detailed picture of power and resistance. Now, the bottom line is that the more you turn up the knob of moral complexity and social commentary, the more realism you necessarily introduce into your story. It all kind of falls apart if there are lightsaber-wielding space wizards and dark lords shooting lightning from their fingers. Now, don't get me wrong, I love those things as much as the next guy, but a character who represents absolute evil cannot exist in the nuanced moral ecosystem of Andor. That's why Palpatine is mentioned in the story, but only in passing. And the assumption is that he actually does not yet have total control over the galaxy and its government. In this version of the Star Wars political landscape, the Emperor's power still depends on the corruptibility of ordinary people, hence his effort to build a superweapon. Now, the final construction of the Death Star in this story represents the totalitarian eclipse, a state in which there can be no hope of resistance. That is the struggle, ultimately, that all of our characters are involved in, whether they're conscious of the Death Star or not. Now, interestingly, you might have noticed one exception to Andor's rule about realism, and that's the moment in Episode 7 when a woman on Yavin senses that Cassian has some kind of predestined part to play in the rebellion. There's no direct mention of her being force-sensitive or anything like that, but I think it's implied. Either way, the point is that it introduces the supernatural into the story for the first and only time, albeit somewhat ambiguously. It's a far cry from old lightning fingers here. To be clear, I realize that this story is set in the same fictional world as other Star Wars stories, so of course the Jedi and the Sith and the Force do exist in Andor's world. I'm just saying the show's creators were smart to never show those things. And it's not only because Disney wanted to chart a new direction for the franchise, it's also because a story about the finer details of power and corruption cannot tolerate moral absolutes like destiny or divine prophecy in its storytelling. Only a story about the Sith deals in absolutes. So on this point of realism, one thing I enjoyed about the show was its production design. You can see that in order to tell a more realistic Star Wars story, they had to bring the galaxy a little closer to Earth. I have a whole video about this, by the way, but the gist is that the world of Andor generally references the real world more than George Lucas' Star Wars films do. You might have heard of the bricks and screws debate surrounding this show, the argument being that George Lucas wanted his fictional world to feel remote, like far, far away. So if something like a Phillips head screw was visible to the viewer, the fantasy would break. And that's true to a degree. But of course, there's a practical limit to this principle, and that boundary is definitely pushed in Andor. My favorite example is the neckties, which are identical to Earth neckties in every respect, except instead of a Windsor knot around the collar, they pass through this futuristic little grommet. It's a space tie, basically, because these are space bureaucrats in a space office in a story about space fascism. The point is that there's really no other way to signal visually that a character like Cyril is an administrator, or to clearly distinguish military officers as such, and so on. Andor is full of examples of this. The fact that there's Imperial news programming is another good example. It might feel slightly weird to see a TV news broadcast in Star Wars, but it's actually necessary for the plot because without some familiar reference to the media of our own world, you can't really have the false flag operation of the kind that plays out in the Gorman Uprising. To the degree that the story is modeled on real-world politics, real-world references are necessary. Just gotta at least make them droids or something. Now for me, the character that makes the most sense in this story is Mon Mothma. Andor takes place in the intervening years between the prequel era and the OT era, and her character is the perfect way of bridging those two periods. You know, one thing that the mainline Skywalker films never really did was explain the origins of the rebellion, and the idea that there was this covert dissent within the Galactic Senate is a smart way of doing that. I like that they show the interior of the Senate chamber exactly as it appears in the prequels. It's a nice bit of continuity that slots Andor neatly into the overall canon. I also like that the Senate still exists and is formally still functional, but is clearly under the control of the Emperor by this point. Let's not forget the line in A New Hope when Grand Moff Tarkin mentions that the Emperor has only very recently dissolved the Senate.
I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently.
This is a nice touch of historical realism. It's often been the case that dictators leave the apparatus of democracy formally intact. Think of the Roman Senate under Augustus, or the Reichstag in Nazi Germany. A hollowed-out and impotent Senate fits right in with the overall concept of the empire as a fascist state emerging out of the collapsing scenery of a democracy. And this is why Mon Mothma's character is just so great. Her story is one of incremental compromise. It's about the gradual moral decay of society. Her character poses the question, at what point does sacrifice for an ideal violate the ideal itself? And again, this fits right in with many of the weightier themes in Star Wars. Mon Mothma's relationship with Luthen is also very interesting. He is a radical pragmatist, meaning he'll do anything necessary for the cause, even if it means betraying his closest allies. So these two characters test each other, and it's the interaction of their respective moral positions that makes their characters so compelling. And this is true of all the characters to some degree, and this is why Andor has a feeling of depth that some other Star Wars series might not, and that depth is ultimately the biggest argument in favor of Andor. Okay, so let's hear the argument against Andor, that it does not take the franchise in a good direction. Comment section is open for business. So I would say one of the most compelling arguments against Andor is that the realism that I described earlier violates the founding principles of the Star Wars fictional universe. In other words, Andor just goes too far, making its world one that is familiar to our own. If we take for granted that Star Wars is and should always be a fantasy story, then Andor does clearly break that convention. One of the more contentious scenes in the story is this one, in which an Imperial officer abuses his power towards some very disturbing ends. It's a type of crime that I'm sure for many is a bridge too far for Star Wars. The concept is not without precedent, but I guess it's different when it's a slug. But more importantly, the more real the Star Wars universe becomes, the more it undermines its own ability to transport us to another galaxy. There's nothing about Andor's story that requires that it be told in a galaxy far, far away. The story easily could have been set here on Earth. And if it's not some form of high fantasy, then why bother setting it in this universe at all? Take Gorman, for example. Is this an alien world? Or is it France? The people, the buildings, even the language. It all makes direct reference to the French Revolution and the French resistance to Nazi occupation. This isn't the first time an alien world has been modeled after Europe, of course, but it feels so much like France that you might forget you're in a galaxy far, far away until the KX series droids show up. One thing you'll notice in Andor compared to other Star Wars projects is a lack of aliens. You know, guys like Quadraneros and Yarael Poof. They're peppered in the background and sometimes thrown in tokenistically, but with the exception of a couple droids, all of the significant characters are just boring old humanoids with a side of calamari. Now, one can see the rationale for this, but it raises the bigger question. If Star Wars is a world that is functionally identical to our own, what use is there in preserving it as a fictional project? Aside from the obvious that slapping the name Star Wars on it will guarantee at least a minimum level of viewership, although even that is kind of questionable today. But probably the strongest argument against Andor is the simple fact that it relies on the narrative context of the Skywalker saga in order to make its story ultimately meaningful. This is, of course, the central dilemma of all the major Disney Star Wars products so far. Let's not forget, Andor is the prequel of the original trilogy. It all points to the singular event of the Death Star plans being delivered to Uncanny Leia, and ultimately to Luke's hero's journey. And what this means is that regardless of how compelling a story Andor tells, it will always feel somewhat subordinate to the greater narrative. If the Skywalker saga is the river for which all other stories are mere tributaries, then inevitably at some point that basin of narrative possibilities dries up. And therefore, while Andor might be a great show on its own terms, it might also be accused of exhausting the narrative possibilities of the franchise rather than revitalizing it. Unless, of course, there are plans for a prequel to Andor that explains the origins of the Empire. If you felt that the show's final episode was a bit inconclusive or lacking in dramatic resolution, this is why. The very final scene is very much a stage setting for Rogue One, and that can feel disappointing for anyone hoping that Andor's story would stand on its own merits and reach its own conclusions. So, with the arguments for and against laid out, what's the final verdict? Does the gritty adult version of Star Wars help or hinder the franchise overall? I suppose time can only tell. It will depend on whether somebody with a strong creative vision can find a way to continue the legacy of Andor and inhabit the Star Wars universe with compelling new characters. For my part, I'll say I'm encouraged by what was achieved with Andor. I've always believed that the original trilogy resonated so deeply because of its, quote, adult themes. Yes, Star Wars is a good time at the movies, but the story of a hero who believes that bad people are ultimately good is universally relatable and actually makes a really profound moral statement. So I like that Andor attempted to reach that level of depth, even if you think it failed. I hope we can at least agree that it was aiming in the right direction. So much of what we've seen from Disney has been shallow, and whether you believe that Star Wars isn't Star Wars without lightsabers, I think we can at least acknowledge that Star Wars isn't Star Wars without emotion. I have to say that Clea pulling the plug on Luthen had more weight and meaning than anything else I've seen in the Disney era of the franchise, and Tony Gilroy should be acknowledged for showing that it's still possible to write original stories in this universe that have the capacity to move people. And for that alone, my personal take is that Andor does represent a new hope for Star Wars, even if it means that a galaxy far, far away feels slightly closer to home than we're used to. So thank you for watching. Check out my Patreon if you'd like to support this channel, and I'll see you on the next one.